All right, next up for our talk this afternoon, we have a talk getting into artifacts and host level technical nitty-gritty again. So we have Dan here talking about host-based ransomware indicators. So welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Brian. All right. Somehow I managed to get up here on the stage, and I have to go after that, which was super interesting. But I'm here to talk about host-based ransomware indicators. But I want to know a little bit more about you so I can kind of guide it in the right direction. So how many people here work on the IR side of these cases? Okay, what about the law enforcement side? Okay. Both? You can. Everyone can. I like that answer. Both is always good. Now, how many people have been doing this less than 5 years or less than a year? So we got some new people. That's good. Sorry. Make this work. So when I first started doing forensics, walked into my first job out of college, someone handed me a hard drive and said, "Tell me what's wrong with this." Just kind of looked at him like, "Any other information?" He's like, "No, just go." So I spent weeks pouring through a hard drive, trying to find a single malware binary, no information. My goal today is that when the first ransomware case crosses your desk, you don't have that same moment of, okay, now what? There we go. So I want you to walk away with the beginning of a plan. Obviously, our plans are going to change. They're going to grow, especially as we learn or as malware and ransomware kind of develop over time. Then that plan is going to become the beginning of a process. That way you kind of can make it defensible. You can make it repeatable, especially if any of you ever have to present this in court. You need to be able to get up there and defend your work. And last, we're going to talk about places that you can actually go and look. So my name's Dan Iannotti. I've been doing forensics now for over 11 years, a variety of different positions. And I'm going to be your guide today through some of those host-based ransomware indicators. Now, how many people always have all of the data they could ever want for every single one of their cases? Yeah, it never happens. Sometimes you don't have enough. Sometimes you have too much. And sometimes you have too much of the wrong kind of data. So let's set the scene for what we're going to talk about today. You just got a new case. It's ransomware. It's your first one. You're talking on the phone. The panicked voices on the other end say that they need answers yesterday. So you get off the phone. You're like, I'm going to start on this right now. You go and you look at the data that was collected for you. And it turns out you've got a ton of Windows system images. No logs, no memory captures, no packet captures, nothing. You're stuck with just terabytes of images from maybe 100 hosts, like endpoints, maybe another 40 servers. I know this has happened to me before. And I know a lot of times in our forensic labs, you might not always get the same network data. So what do you do first? How do you move the needle on this case in a reasonable amount of time? You can't just sit there and go, I'm going to start with the first one that was collected and go through. It could take you weeks to get through that. So we're going to talk about system prioritization. And then obviously everyone wants to know, well, how did they get into my network? Just tell me how. So we're going to talk about some of the common ways that our threat actors get in, and whether or not that's still going to be an issue. And keep in mind, this is all coming from our endpoints. We also want to know what they did while they were in there, what tools they were running, what might be at risk, as well as what data they were accessing, so that counsel and the people in charge can make a decision about whether or not they need to notify victims or they know that data was lost. And then obviously we want to know, are they still in there? My disclaimer, my standard forensic answer, it depends. You ask me a question, there's a 99% chance you're going to get a "it depends." We're not going to be able to cover every single artifact. We're not going to be able to cover everything in depth. And there's always situations where, well, that doesn't really apply because Windows wasn't working right. So let's start with system prioritization. Domain controllers, right at the center. What threat actor is not going to want to get to your domain controller? It's where I'd want to go. It's connected to everything. You're able to get from one location to the other. So once you're there, you can pretty much go where you want. Now at the top, we see the web servers and things that are facing the internet, like Exchange. We had a whole bunch of vulnerabilities last spring, all around about Exchange, but also our web servers, anything that's facing the internet. That includes RDP servers. Our threat actors love to use RDP, so we're going to want to look at those. SQL servers and file servers, that's where our data lives. That's why we need to look at those things to see, were they accessing that data via network share, or were they on that system zipping it up and sending it off to who knows where? And then this last one, user endpoints. Little asterisk there. If you have 100 endpoints, where do you start? Maybe you have specific intelligence that says that Bob in accounting went ahead and clicked on a phishing link. All right, so maybe you start there. But what if you don't have that? Are you going to prioritize looking at 100 endpoints when you know they're going to go to other places? So using the information we have about our incidents can help us make sure that we're prioritizing our data in a good way. So moving on to some access vectors. The three big ones: phishing, RDP, and then web vulnerabilities. Phishing, when it comes to host-based indicators for phishing, well, you're kind of stuck with digging through PSTs. There are obviously tools out there that can help with that. You can go pull PSTs manually if you have to. Now, RDP, this is one of my favorite. Shodan, it's very helpful. Put in your client's IP address, you can see if it was open or if it was recently closed. I had one, they're like, no, we closed RDP. Look back and we're like, well, the day before your incident, Shodan shows that it was open. And they're kind of like, oh, well, yeah, we closed it when they got in. So this is from a map from last week of just RDP that's in this area. Doesn't mean they're all insecure or not being secured, but this is what Shodan can see for RDP ports that are just out there. And so when it comes to our forensic artifacts, we are interested in both inbound RDP as well as outbound. So inbound, this is one of my favorite artifacts. Microsoft Windows, Terminal Services, Location Session Manager, or Local Session Manager, Operational. These three event IDs are going to get you connections, disconnections, reconnections, and you can start to figure out which ones are malicious. Some are going to have external IPs. Maybe that organization is set up to do outside RDP like that. So we can use tools to kind of geolocate that. I made all this data up. It's not an actual case. See, this one comes back to a hosting site in France. And you can see the connection with event ID 21, disconnection with 24, and then 25 is if they reconnect to the same session. And then we can also correlate this with the security.evtx log. Obviously, this is provided it hasn't been cleared or overwritten. We see a lot of log roll for security.evtx just from the sheer number. But if you have a 4624 type 10, that's your remote logon. You get a lot of the same information. But if you compare that with a series of 4625s, that 4625 is a failed logon. If you see 100 or 1,000, looks like someone might have been trying to brute force a password. A brute force password is always good to be like, hey, they just tried every possible password for this account until it worked. It's a very different conversation than, well, it looks like somebody else reused a password and they were able to go directly to domain admin on our system. And so internal lateral movement, that's really going to be our outbound RDP because we only have the systems inside our network. So looking at this RDP client operational, we can see attempts to do lateral movement as well as whether or not they were successful. That's our 1124 and our 1102 event IDs. And then we'll also see the 4648 in our security event log. This is going to tell us where our threat actor went. Did they come into the Exchange server, figure out what they were doing, and then start moving off in different directions? Or did they just stay where they were? And last, we have some vulnerable applications. We had the Exchange vulnerabilities, we had Log4j, and we had some VPN and some firewall issues. And that's just recently. Now, not all of these things are necessarily going to leave a lot of host-based indicators. But you might get some web shells. Those web shells, you can use tools that Microsoft puts out. So they put out a safety scanner, make a copy of it, point it at it, and it'll tell you, hey, this looks like a malicious web shell. Obviously, this looks very suspicious because legitimate things don't usually use zeros as O's. The other thing that we've seen is the Windows PowerShell.evtx, security ID 400. Start pulling out bits of those scripts that are being run that tell us what will often leave behind encoded commands. And those encoded commands, they could be anything. They could be beacons or other payloads. Got to decode them to find out. So that's access. But now that they're in there, we need to figure out what they've been doing. And that really comes down to program execution. One of my favorite quotes, and I don't remember who said it, but malware can hide, but it has to run. If they're not executing it, it's not doing anything. We see different threat actors use different tools, and these artifacts are going to cover a range of those tools. Whether it's Mimikatz or network scanners or PSExec, things like service installs through the system.evtx. That might say, oh, there's a Cobalt Strike beacon here. Decode the beacon, figure out a little bit more detail, and go from there. User assist. It's great. It gives you what user executed it, when it was last executed. but it's limited to graphical user interface programs. So if they're just running something in the background or via command line, you might be out of luck there. And you've got your amcache. I love the amcache. It likes to give me hashes for our programs, and then I can throw those in VirusTotal and see if anything comes back. But again, you're not going to have all the information. You're not going to have user information for amcache. Maybe it's tucked away in like my user app data folder, and that's the path. This is a pretty good indicator that someone was in my path, but maybe it wasn't. We have things like prefetch, giving us the last 8 execution times. That's a lot. However, that's only going to be on your endpoints. It's not going to be on your servers. And then we have shimcache. Shimcache is, to me, it's an honorable mention. It gives you a lot of information about executables that are on your system. It's not fully reliable about them have actually been executed. It's definitely not going to give you an accurate time. But when you have nothing else, usually something shows up in the shimcache. And I wanted to talk about the master file table. This master file table tracks all of the information about different files, like our ransomware binary or our ransomware nodes. It's probably interesting to see when that actual binary shows up on your system, and then you might be able to track it back from there, or see when they actually put it on there, and do they put it on and then go, let me go look at all the network information. But the thing that I particularly like are the ransomware nodes. There's so many copies of that ransomware node across a single drive, never mind across a network. I've seen some ransomwares that they're putting ransomware nodes in every single directory. They're like, oh, here's a directory, here's a ransomware node. But then when you start looking across the network, you can now see how that ransomware spread. Did it go out and do the file server first? Did it go to the endpoints first? Did it come back last? And then one little extra tidbit, the ntuser.dat file of the account that launched the ransomware doesn't usually get encrypted. So if all your other ones are encrypted, you kind of like, it's weird that this one account is no longer encrypted. So that could give you another indicator of this account's been compromised. I should investigate it further. Now, data access. We need to understand what our threat actors were looking for. Maybe they were just poking around. Maybe they really wanted to dive deep into the financial information, try to make an assessment for how much they could get on their ransom. So we need different places that we can look to figure out what our compromised user accounts were looking at when we know they were compromised. So definitely a lot of information up here. We've got shell bags and recent docs. Our shell bags are going to track all of our folder activity. We open this folder and then this folder, and we can kind of start to see that navigation. And that recent docs, I mean, it's in the name. It's showing you what files were recently opened. We've got jump lists and link files. Those jump lists are going to show you per application when files were opened. And the link files, we heard about those earlier too. That might give you even more indication of which files have been opened recently. And then browser history. Our browser history is going to track our local file access. We've also seen that browser history point out and just start downloading other programs. They didn't have a tool they needed, but it's publicly available on the web. We saw one, they're like, you also see them Google instructions. How do I use Megasync? How do I make sure this gets to the right place, you're kind of like, oh, okay. They don't necessarily know exactly what they're doing, and they're clearly doing it manually. Which brings us to persistence. Obviously, our threat actors, they want to sit on these systems, and they want to be able to come back. And what I've seen is really there's kind of 3 different ways that they're doing it. They're using the run keys, like run and run once, so that every time a user or a system is logged into, it reruns whatever program is set, and they can regain access. But also scheduled tasks. Every hour I want to reach out to this, or want to reach out here, or want to download this file or run this program. The other is third-party programs like AnyDesk or Screen Connect. Now these could be legitimately being used in your organization, which just makes it harder because then you have to go through and try to figure out if and when those things are being legitimately used versus being abused or not at all. So that's persistence. Now, obviously, we've talked about a lot of different things, and that's just part of the file system artifacts that are out there, or Windows artifacts that are out there. But how do we make this a little bit more efficient than just, I have to go to each system and look for stuff? That's where things like scripting and automation come in. So we want to also prioritize the artifacts that are going to give us the most complete information. Something like service installs. It's going to give us dates and times, username, the system. You're going to get all that complete information from that artifact rather than having to go to a number of artifacts. And from there, we can take that and we can script it or automate it. So I had a PowerShell script that ran through pretty much all of those artifacts that I just talked about. Immediately just take the collection, point the PowerShell script at it. 10, 15 minutes later, I've got my bunch of CSVs, and it says, here, this is where you can start. Now, there's obviously other more powerful automation platforms out there besides the PowerShell script. Those can be used too. Threat intel. Sometimes, if you have no clue, but the good thing about ransomware is they want it to be found and they want you to know who they are, you can go look up some of the threat intelligence. Go figure out, okay, well, how do they usually get in? How do they move laterally? What happens? I did that once, and I found that they tend to use an executable called EFS Potato. And that would get them from the Exchange server to the domain controller. And I'm like, okay, well, that's very specific. Let's go see what I can find. Lo and behold, EFS Potato showed up. Not something I would have necessarily caught on my first pass, but now I look for EFS Potato every time I'm doing an investigation. And then if you're using endpoint detection tools, that they usually have some features that will let you kind of do this across your enterprise. So again, these are the different categories we talked about. And then these are some of the artifacts that we talked about. And there are more. This is just the tip of the iceberg. And I figured I'd put this up here. These are pretty much where all of that data that I talked about, all of those artifacts, come from these few locations. So if you're going out and you're trying to think about what to collect, and if you're trying to prioritize things so you're not just collecting terabytes of data, you're going to want the Windows event logs. You're going to want the registry keys. You're going to want that browser data. And that should get you the majority of the things that we talked about. I think we're running a little short on time, but I am happy to answer questions. And that's where you can find me on the internet. But yeah, if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them now or offline, either way.